Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? The news items we have for you this week start with the inevitable and invariable results of anti-vaxxers spreading measles, a confirmed death amongst adults. There is the unsurprising consequences of trying to spread anti-vaxxer news, but particularly in California where a doctor has been reprimanded, although it's really nothing more than a slap on the wrist. An experimental therapy for cancer using a messenger RNA has been given to a patient in the UK. The effects that caffeine might have on your body, particularly as it relates to body fat and diabetes. At the same time, things like BMI and dieting are no longer taught in Australia, although why children would be taught about dieting, let alone BMI, is something of a mystery. We have a very bad study talking about external Ki and the ability to kill lung cancer cells, otherwise known as utter nonsense. A very bad article that relies on the recent American Academy of Pediatrics article to justify its otherwise bullshit content. A puppy that unfortunately lost part of its jaw due to cancer has grown it back, and Saturn's Death Star moon has a secret. It's not a moon, or should it be, that's no moon. The timestamps for these and others can be found in the description box below. Let's start with disappointment. It's the first confirmed death of an adult due to measles in Ireland. Unfortunately, the adult died and is one of about 5 confirmed cases this year. Admittedly, the other 4 did not die. But as the Irish Health Service reports, it's all down to the lack of herd immunity. There were no deaths in the previous 3 years, that being 2020 through to 2023. It's only once cases started going up significantly enough in 2023 that we've led to this point. That is, invariably, there will be adults in a position where, due to their own personal health circumstances, they are vulnerable to measles and will die. Now, this could be an extremely elderly adult where it's shingles, which is just a re-emergence of measles, or it could be somebody who has underlying health concerns. The final possibility is somebody who, due to their own health concerns, could never get the vaccine when they were young. No matter which it is, this is an avoidable situation, something that we shouldn't need to worry about. Measles was eradicated. And yet here we are again with people dying from it unnecessarily. To rehash something we've said before, the amount of population needing to be vaccinated is about 90 to 95%. So long as we sit in that window, we should have herd immunity. Above 95% is better, but somewhere in that range should be okay. We're currently sitting as low as 80% in some countries. And this is all because the MMR vaccine, although being safe and effective, is declined by idiotic parents. Parents who believe Wakefield's bullshit, for example. Shifting to other treatment-related news, and this time treatment rather than prophylaxis, we have the regular use of antifungal creams. Antifungal creams are used for things like tinea. Unfortunately, it could also be contributing to an increase in resistant fungi. The reason for this is exactly the same as uncontrolled and unrestricted use of antibiotics. Unfortunately, people rarely continue to apply treatment until the problem is entirely eradicated. They just continue to apply it until they think the problem is gone. In the case of antibiotics, this often leaves part of the prescription unused. For others, it is, unsurprisingly, simply until they no longer perceive they have something like tinea. The problem with fungi is that, unlike bacteria, there isn't as much, let's say, attention. Despite the fact that fungi are fungi, pun intended, they don't get the same attention, therefore they don't get the same funding or research to try and figure out a way to stop them from being a problem, especially if they are treatment resistant. This has led to at least a few cases in recent history, that being roughly the last 12 months, of treatment-resistant fungi that simply weren't responding as intended. In Southeast Asia, this is significantly more of a concern. That's largely owing to the fact that there are somewhat less rigorous restrictions on their usage. In America, this rather obviously led to some interest from the CDC, and they found effectively the same pathway to developing these super fungi as with superbacteria. That is, overzealous prescribers are giving out prescriptions for antifungal creams left, right, and center. It's almost like an Oprah show. You get antifungals, you get antifungals, and you get antifungals. But no, you shouldn't be doing that. There are better ways to deal with it initially, and then you gradually escalate. You go from a relatively mundane treatment, like, keep your feet clean, to something more serious, like a applicable cleaning agent, something to sterilize the site. And then you get to antifungal creams, and then to antifungal medication you take orally, and so on. Admittedly, overzealous doctors aren't just getting in trouble, or at least creating trouble, through their overzealous prescribing of antifungals. Some are getting in trouble for medical malpractice of a kind, specifically ethical and professionalism problems. Simone Gold, the founder of the, interesting America's Frontline Doctors, has found themselves in trouble for not just their usual nonsense, but their usual nonsense in relation to the January 6 Capitol riots. How it is that the medical board has penalized them for an otherwise unrelated federal crime is a different matter entirely, but it would appear that not just do they have to deal with the nonsense associated with that, which is federal crime nonsense, so probably more than a slight slap on the wrist. The board itself has issued them a 31-page order. The 31-page order includes them to pay for the reasonable costs of investigation and prosecution, an interesting practice that will cost Simone Gold nearly $27,000, but they're also required to take an educational course in professionalism and ethics, which that one is more a slap on the wrist. The consequences for this are, other than the financial burden, are relatively mild. It would be interesting to see if the decision was pursued at a federal level through SCOTUS due to the freedom of speech clause, specifically relating to political expression, and that they may be able to argue that, but otherwise it's fairly straightforward. They're currently on probation, they have to undergo a degree of retraining, and they have to pay a lot of money. Shifting from news that's honestly somewhat all over the place to theoretically much more useful news and research, we have a contact lens that should be able to correct vision. It uses a optical vortex, which is a way of designing the lens in such a way that it will allow the eye to be able to adjust. It effectively creates multiple layers of vision. This means that the eye itself will begin to change the way the muscles work to compensate for the slight offset that it creates at different points. So if you're trying to look at a very close distance object, you don't need to worry so much if you have long vision. Conversely, if you have short vision, the same applies, but it's able to compensate for these differences. The technology behind this is not actually necessarily all that new. The scale definitely is, but the actual technology is not. It uses something that is called a spiral diopter. This causes the light as it passes through to spin, and because it spins, it can adjust for the differences and, more importantly, deformations in the cornea. Because it's adjusting for this, it means you don't need to actually have the eye itself necessarily fix itself. For example, what you do with regular contact lenses or glasses. This entirely compensates for those changes through the way the light hits the eye. The reason this is both a desirable feature of it and arguably something that will still be a while off is that most of the time you require multiple components to get this vortex effect, but they've been able to achieve it using a single layer of what is effectively a lens. Because of that, however, it is slower to make, and it will be a long time off yet before they're anywhere near commercial manufacturing levels. In news that is likely to see something very soon, in fact it's happening now, although not at a common level, we have a UK patient receiving an mRNA cancer therapy. Now, this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. There have been several proposals and several clinical trials of mRNA used to create antigens for the immune system to recognize a particular cancer and then target it. This is not necessarily new. It's the nature of this particular mRNA vaccine, so to say, plus the fact that it's being applied on a reasonably national level organization, the NHS, although likely it's only a single location and individual based on what's available. The technology uses exactly the same concept as, say, for example, the COVID-19 vaccines. You take mRNA, you create a sequence within that will produce the necessary antigens for the immune system to recognize what's going on. Importantly, it's your own immune system that provides the necessary protection based on this antigen, because the mRNA itself will break down in about a week to 10 days, give or take a few. You'll find that very quickly your body develops an immunological response. It's able to deal with the cancer itself, or at least put a lot of pressure on the cancer, and from there you have a reasonably endogenous response to what's happening. That means things like chemotherapy could be useful, but they're more adjunctive rather than the primary treatment. It allows for a lot less intervention, which can cause complications than otherwise required. Take, for example, the consequences of chemotherapy: loss of hair and often GI tract problems. This is because the cells that are within your GI tract and the cells giving rise to your hair stop dividing. Because of this, there's obviously unpleasantness associated with it. It's also because the chemotherapy is not necessarily specific to just the cancer cells. That's not true of this mRNA-based therapy, because it is specific to producing antigens to the cancer, and your immune system will only target the cancer. It allows for a very effective, very targeted, and ultimately very efficient attack on the cancer without any of the unintended side effects. Importantly though, this is fundamentally a clinical trial, and as such, it's only laying the groundwork for future deployment of it. Even more so again when you consider it's a single individual receiving it. Where this particular treatment is important is not so much in everything we've described so far, as that's true of any kind of mRNA-based vaccine or similar for cancer. What is important with this is that it's a generic off-the-shelf solution. Most other mRNA therapies for cancer rely on the ability to take a sample of the tumor itself and develop the necessary mRNA as an antigen creating process, and then use that to generate the immunological response. It's a lot more tailored and it's a lot more work. This is pretty much, you can take anybody who has a cancer of the kind that's relevant to this treatment and inject them with the vaccine type product that will then generate the response, and suddenly you have a mobilized immune system able to attack that cancer. In similar related news, for a clinical trial, we have Neuralink and the fact that it's being implanted into a human brain very shortly, and possibly by the time this video goes live, it has been implanted. Neuralink is a effectively project, although at this stage a clinical trial, to wirelessly connect a human brain with a whole bunch of other things. How useful this will be at the moment is not entirely clear, but it's possible that it could well prove to be the first in a series of very major developments in how we make otherwise mundane parts of life much easier. The clinical trials have been a long time in coming, largely down to the FDA being a little bit hesitant to approve any kind of intervention involving the human brain. They needed to undergo a lot more testing in animal models to prove that what they were going to do is going to work. Part of what makes Neuralink important as far as milestones go is that where other clinical trials will often involve a surgeon being trained how to do this, then going off and doing it in their own particular facility or center. Neuralink relies entirely on a robot. Therefore, a robot can be programmed to perform exactly the same functionality regardless of where it is and who it's operating on, which is distinct from a lot of clinical trials relying on surgeons. There's a lot more variability between individuals, how well they learn the process, and so on. And because of this, Neuralink provides not just an opportunity for a very standardized outcome, theoretically anyway, but also a vast improvement over the unpredictability of surgeons doing the same work. Further, unlike other implants themselves, the Neuralink implant is not just wireless, but it also involves a lot more integration with the brain itself. The tiny, and we mean really tiny at 10 to 12 microns, needles that are playing the role of the, let's say, interpreter or at least collector of data within the brain are so small that they produce almost no harm to the brain. To be clear, almost no harm. There is going to be minimal damage, largely because you're inserting a random foreign object in there, but nonetheless, it is still tiny by comparison to other approaches. For now, all we can really do is wait and see how the patient recovers, which from news so far is going well, and what possible outcomes there are from this. Hopefully it is the beginning of something rather big, but it could also be the whimper of something failing very quietly. Shifting to day-to-day news, we have the relationship between caffeine, body fat, and possible diabetes. Now, to be clear about it, a lot of this research has kind of already been covered elsewhere before now. For example, caffeine is known to protect your liver from fatty liver disease, but also to provide other protective effects such as cardiovascular disease. Then there are things like diabetes. Now, diabetes is not necessarily linked solely to caffeine, and in fact it's largely driven by your consumption of things like glucose and more broadly sugar. That is not to say that the consumption of the magical beverage known as coffee, or for that matter things like Coca-Cola, tea and so on, aren't without merit in terms of this, and more so when we look at where the research is coming from. Although the Karolinska Institute in Sweden is by no means a, conflict or a controversy-free institute, it's certainly better than others. Plus, they are collaborating with others, such as Bristol in the UK and Imperial College London. So, we're not exactly talking an isolated institute here. That should give us a good indicator that the work is, somewhat more reliable. Although, more reliable is not necessarily the same as entirely reliable, so again, take this with a great deal of skepticism. What they found is a relationship between the ability of particular genetic markers to predict the increase in plasma caffeine concentrations, and that this in turn was related to lower BMI and the amount of fat across the body in general, as BMI is not necessarily an indicator of fat. There was also a relationship between plasma concentrations of caffeine and a lowered risk of type 2 diabetes. Importantly, the researchers did note that about half of the effect that is protecting your body from diabetes came by caffeine reducing your BMI, which means it's not a direct protective effect from the caffeine. It has to undergo several other steps, but those other steps do provide further protection from other things, so it's not as though this is a loss regardless. For example, if you were to lower BMI, your risk of cardiovascular disease goes down. To a certain extent, things like arthritis are likely to be less significant as you're putting less weight on your joints and so on. So it's not just that you have a lower risk of diabetes. But diabetes itself is already pretty shit though. The study did involve data from about 10,000 people from existing genetic databases, so this is one concern to be aware of. Because of what it is and how it's done, it is entirely retroactive analyses, at least as far as the prediction of certain genes and what happens with plasma caffeine goes, so there is some concern there. What's important is the research into caffeine like this is fairly well established, and to be frank about it, pretty much given in a way that shows the researchers accept the limitations of what they've done. At the other side of this coin, we have claims that kimchi will make you lose weight. The answer to this is probably no, and probably no for fairly good reasons. Beyond the fact that kimchi is an acquired taste, as nice as it may be, it's not for everybody. As noted in the article we sourced this from, kimchi is both claimed to be recently a superfood that will help you lose weight if you eat it 3 times a day. Anytime something is sold as a superfood, you should immediately start ignoring whatever article that is and close the tab, because it's bullshit. The short version of this entire article is very simply, the study was flawed, the responses were limited, and they didn't really do much in the way of follow-up work. So everything they've tried to claim is really limited. There's also the fact that there's some interesting conflicts of interest regarding who and what is paying and working for where. By contrast to the caffeine-based study, you're basically looking at a very limited snapshot with very limited support for the conclusions, versus a 10,000 strong retroactive analysis of genetics and various other data points. Take your pick as to which you think is more reliable, although we may judge you based on your decision. In other weight-related news, although again this one's confusing, BMI and dieting will no longer be taught in Australian schools. Why this is just plain bizarre, as although BMI is useful to know about, why would you be teaching children about dieting? The kids have enough concerns, and particularly once they get into high school, enough worries about puberty and the various social pressures that go along with it, let alone teaching children who are in primary school about this. Part of the reasoning behind this appears to be an attempt to stop issues around eating disorders, which is laudable. Admittedly, the lead up to eating disorders tends to be more than just that they're taught about diets and BMI in primary school. But the other reason is to foster positive body image, which is just another way of saying fat acceptance, which, no, being fat, whether that's overweight or obese, is not something you should be accepting. It is not good for the individual, and it does, at least in Australia, have carry-on effects to others, because an overweight or obese individual will have more requirements of the healthcare services, which are publicly funded, and therefore place more burden on society. Figuratively and literally, they're being carried by the taxpayer. Frustratingly, this seems to be a case of the pendulum swung way too far in one direction. Admittedly, it's probably swinging back from too far in the other direction, but nonetheless, we've gone from a social pressure to be overly thin and therefore anorexic or otherwise having a eating disorder such as bulimia, to now going, oh, everybody should not have to worry about what they eat and just embrace being overweight. No. There is a middle point, and unfortunately, it doesn't look like the Australian education system is quite grasping this particular problem, which is something of an irony given that they're meant to be teachers. There is similar news that could apply to young people, and it has to do with one of the arguable leading causes of weight gain, video games. Admittedly, you can get quite a bit of exercise playing video games, largely owing to the screaming, ranting, raving, and waving of arms due to lag kills, but more likely just due to being a bad player. However, the other risk other than weight gain and consequential issues with that is hearing loss apparently. It seems that using headphones during video game sessions could be contributing to hearing loss. To be clear, the research into this is based on a meta-analysis, or more accurately a systematic review, which is a kind of meta-analysis. But nonetheless, what they found was 14 papers with 50,000 individuals and based in 9 different countries. So we can kind of say that they've got a pretty good grasp of the picture at the moment. They analyzed these to try and figure out whether or not there was a relationship between video games and hearing loss, or at least hearing damage. They found that loudness and exposure time pretty much are the common factors, which isn't news to anybody. Frankly, it's why if you use power tools, you should wear hearing protection. If you work in a factory, hearing protection. If you work in a construction site, hearing protection, so on and so forth. One reason that hearing protection is not for video game playing is very simply that oftentimes cues are not very loud. As a result, if you want to hear someone walking on the floor above you, you need to have the sound turned up. This is often why headphones are playing sounds very loud. The article does go into a great deal more detail, and particularly noteworthy is the disconcerting sounds of, or volume of sound in these video games. That is, the average sound volume was between 88.5 and 91.2 decibels, with peaks as high as 119 decibels. Understand, a motorbike engine has a loudness of about 95 decibels. That's supposed to be something you can deal with quite happily for an hour and 15 minutes. 95 decibels is just over the average height of the sound wave in these games, let alone the peak, which is considerably more. And that might be what's contributing to this. We should point out that the average of 88.5 to 91.2 decibels is based on shooting games, first-person shooters to be more specific, but nonetheless, whereas some of the other studies were based in arcades. It's important to point this out, as it does mean that there's a lot of scope that they're trying to cover from a very small number of studies for the nature of what they're aiming at. And then they include mobile games, which calling those games is perhaps a little too generous. The chances that this study will have any real lasting impact, though, is really limited, mostly because people aren't going to listen to them. Video games are too much fun and too many people enjoy them, so it's not going to change anything. Next we have something of a throwback, although the throwback is still current today. It's an article all about external qi, and claims that it was being used to kill cancer cells. Just no. Things like acupuncture, Reiki, and other metaphysical energies just don't exist. Trying to use them to cause any harm to a cancer is kinda like fighting into the wind. All it's going to do is make you look an idiot and possibly stink. It's useless. The reason we bring up this somewhat older article is simply that it goes through what is fundamentally the cornerstone of all pseudoscientific and similar alternative therapy bullshit, because it points out that the methodology is so damn flawed that we have no idea what's happening. None. All this article tells us about the external Q therapy is that it lasted for about 5 minutes. Okay, did they go in there and just stare intently at the petri dish, or what was it? And somehow or other, they believe that the external key therapy has killed cancer cells. Yeah, okay, how does anybody, at least anybody who's qualified to do so, replicate this study without knowing what it is that the external key practitioner was doing? This is made all the harder when the studies that are cited explain that the external key practitioner was effectively locked in the laboratory room with the samples by themselves for the time frame in question. Nobody knows what they were doing, how or why. And yet somehow or other they've managed to achieve amazing results. Yeah, there are some very simple explanations that probably better explain what happened, and none of them involve external key. Shifting from research that's completely useless but demonstrates the entirety of the shit show that is alternative medicine, to actual research that has not only function, but is proven to work. It's a 3D printed brain tissue. Yeah, this might sound really weird, but it's a brain tissue that has been 3D printed and grows. But not only does it grow, it works. And that's the key thing here. The work from the University of Wisconsin-Madison has found a way to be able to take cultured cells and not only print them in multiple layers, but be able to effectively recreate some of the more challenging aspects of neurology for modeling diseases. That is, how do you get the various cells to grow in multiple layers and give you a three-dimensional understanding of what's happening, rather than the relatively standard, more two-dimensional mat of cells in cell culture. This research is somewhat important for two reasons. First of all, we have the whole pathology issue, which, as mentioned, allows us to recreate them and therefore model what's happening and develop treatments. The other reason is somewhat more, let's say, science-specific. That is, this has built on and resolved many of the issues around the current approaches, whether that is the whole issue of having the available equipment, which is often not only very expensive, but very specialized and therefore well outside the reach of many laboratories. But this method is much more simple, much more pragmatic, and works better because of what it's doing. It doesn't have any of the same limitations as using non-biological scaffolds, for instance. They're using a bio-ink gel, and this pretty much allows the cells to be printed almost like an ink printer, but across multiple layers, allowing for the neurons to grow into each other and start communicating. Doing it this way, not only do you have the neurons there, but you have the support cells and everything else required, because the gel is at least semi-permeable, allowing for all the necessary activity. As cool as this is, there are some major problems with it, and these are kind of significant. The first and biggest is that it doesn't actually resemble a true brain. Admittedly, it's slightly more practical than an organoid, but it's also not as good as an organoid in that respect. Organoids have all of the, let's say, expected organization of a brain, or at least a brain-like structure. This doesn't, but this is much more controlled. The other is that there's no real way to control the direction of the neurons, which is a slight hiccup, but when you join together the role of an organoid and the functionality of this approach, you can figure out a lot more content than you would otherwise be able to without it, and that's a massive step forwards. Shifting to somewhat agricultural news, although this time looking more at bad research and how it gets used. It's a, let's call it an article, because it is, although more like propaganda, and it's from the Honolulu Civil Beat. What it does is it tries to use the recent Academic of Pediatrics article, more like a hit piece, and explain from that Roundup or glyphosate should not be used. The very fact that the second paragraph within this article reads, "Last month, the American Academy of Pediatrics released a clinical report discussing the potential dangers of the herbicide glyphosate in our food supply. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup-like herbicides." No, they didn't. They made a hit piece that has been utterly eviscerated for being a load of bullshit. Second of all, it's not a clinical report. It's more like a review, but nonetheless, given the original point, which is it's a load of bullshit, you can basically ignore what it has to say. The article goes on to a whole bunch of other points regarding attempts to try and ban glyphosate, why they're doing so, and the purported benefits they believe will follow as a result. Just no. Roundup is one of the safest options at the moment. Second, because it is safe and because it is relatively easy to apply, it gets used widely and effectively. When not used effectively, you obviously don't have the results intended. That's because glyphosate has certain applications it is meant for, mostly broadleaf weeds. The article itself then proceeds to make pretty much exactly the same mistakes that the American Academy of Pediatrics study did, not understanding, first of all, dose. That is, any glyphosate that may find its way into the food supply after it's been applied to Roundup Ready crops is a regulated amount. If it exceeds that, food can't go to market. If it's below that amount, it's fine, because the dose is nowhere near a concern. Let's be clear about this. It is such a minuscule dose that you wouldn't even know it's there except for the use of incredibly sensitive equipment designed to pick up the smallest of trace amounts of things that we wouldn't ever expect to see any kind of response from. The article also makes up some of the more bullshit claims that really have not been justified. For example, endocrine disruption from glyphosate usage. No. Just no. If there was endocrine disruption from glyphosate, we would see it in farmers who are exposed to exceptionally high concentrations by comparison to the general population. And because we don't see it in farmers, it is more than fair to say it is not a thing that happens. It would have to be dose responsible, and because it's not responding to a dose, that is, the people who get the most glyphosate exposure don't have it, it's not a thing. And no matter how much they try and justify it by saying, oh, the AAP had 76 references to scientific papers and studies, it doesn't mean shit. You can make up a lot of stuff and stick in a reference at the end of it, and unless people go through and check whether or not what you're accurately saying is represented by the source, no. It doesn't help that the individual responsible for writing this is a member of the AAP and therefore probably feels a certain degree of obligation to defend their peers for their stupid hit piece. Shifting to news that's slightly more promising and far less frustrating, although technically it is still wrong, we have Indian farmers using AI to increase crop yields. Now, to be clear about this, they're not using AI, they are using machine learning. Although it's related, it is a far more primitive idea. It's incredibly common now, but it is not AI. Nonetheless, the Indian farmers are working in collaboration with various organizations and tech companies to create a project known as Sagu Bagu. This was using data from 7,000 chili farmers and then providing the data from those farmers to be integrated at a central point and tell them what, how, where, and why. A relatively straightforward idea. What is frustrating is the article even understands that they are using machine learning. Specifically, one of the paragraphs opens with, an advocate startup established local soil testing centers equipped with machine learning technology. Yes, all of this is machine learning. You're just integrating multiple parallel machine learning systems into another, more higher tiered system to be able to apply the results of those individual systems. While the naming mistakes are frustrating, the results cannot be denied, although they are early at this stage with an 18-month pilot program. The 18 months is important, as it means there were 3 consecutive planting seasons that were examined. There was a 21% increase in plant growth per an acre. There's a reduction in pesticide and fertilizer usage, although pesticide usage was the more significant factor at 9% reduction. Fertilizer usage is somewhat questionable at 5%, and very much depending on the nature of any studies done alongside this, that 5% may or may not fall outside the range of significance. Nonetheless, it is still there. They also found an 8% increase in their sales price. Therefore, you can see how it is that collecting data and plugging it into a machine learning algorithm can have a not insignificant benefit. It's something that the rest of the world really should be paying more attention to and using. Shifting to animal news, although somewhat of a feel-good news piece, we have a puppy that lost part of its jaw, which is kind of terrible. But because they were very young, the 3-month-old French bulldog was able to regrow part of that jaw. The vets in question conducted a surgery of the 3-month-old pup to remove the majority of the lower left jaw. When they returned 8 weeks after surgery, scans found that the jaw had regrown, which is a good sign, although take it with some concern, mostly owing to the fact that it was removed due to cancer. The regrowing of the bone could also be an indicator of cancer. So just be mindful of this. Depending on whether or not it was a bone cancer or another kind of cancer, this could be a bigger issue in the future. However, assuming that it was not a bone cancer, it does show that if you conduct surgeries like this on a very young dog, they do have the ability to regrow the damage. Of course, the regrowth has not been perfect. For example, the regrown jaw doesn't actually have any teeth in it to speak of. As a result, there aren't any teeth, and so he doesn't have the ability to chew. But the jaw being there does have other benefits, other than just being a cosmetic improvement. Because it is there and structurally providing support to the other side of the jaw, it prevents issues to do with misalignment of teeth, issues to do with the jaw not aligning correctly, and not just the teeth but the entire jaw shifting out of place, and a range of other concerns that may have required further surgery in the future. Shifting from animal news to what is effectively academic news, although academic isn't quite the right word for this. It's a decision by the University of Michigan to approve a new free speech statement. Now, this is important as not only was it unanimously approved, but it's being approved in a university, which is important as universities have increasingly become very, the word conservative would be applicable, except the problem is it's not really conservative in the political sense, it's that language is more heavily policed. This statement from the university has rolled back a lot of that conservatism. What is important here is that the university is very much trying to maintain a open environment, admittedly with some limitations, but those limitations shouldn't be anything more than general civility. That's pretty much what a university should be, a melting pot of ideas. But that hasn't been the case, and that's the key here. The university, by virtue of this, has committed to freedom of expression, diversity, and thought. The last time they said something to this effect was in 1988. That tells you how seriously they view the shift in the Overton window at the university. In fact, part of their statement should be applicable to any university. To meet conflict and controversy with understanding and reason, refuting our opponents rather than revoking invitations or refusing them a platform and contesting their ideas instead of attacking their character. Yeah, that's what universities should be doing. You should be able to find an idea, discuss it, analyze it, and then see whether or not you agree with what you've been presented with, without having to worry about being attacked, whether directly or personally. It's rather funny that the University of Michigan has a better understanding of the idea of applying and understanding this than the Nuremberg Pug affair. The final news we have for you this week is all about that's not a moon. Well, more specifically Saturn's moon, but it's not a Death Star. Not anymore anyway. Theoretically, it could well have life. One of Saturn's smallest major moons could well be having a new resurgence in interest. That new resurgence is all down to the fact that it has an ocean, a liquid ocean. Other planets and moons have various oceans, but they're often not made of water, and they're kind of terrifying. MyMass could well be at least less terrifying. MyMass, at least from a astronomical point of view, has a very clearly icy surface. Think of Antarctica with all of its floating ice, and you get an idea. However, that icy surface has also been cracked, and that's an indicator to astronomers until now that it has zero liquid water on it. However, newer research would indicate that that may not be the case. They believe that somewhere between 19 and 30 kilometers below the surface, there is likely to be a liquid water. The reason they think this is that the moon wobbles as it orbits Saturn, and that would be a sign that something fairly major inside the moon is moving around, and moving around quite aggressively. Now, this could be a being from outer dimension, and therefore we have to worry about eldritch gods, or it could be that the water layer is moving around just like the tides on Earth, and that is what's causing the moon to wobble as it goes about its orbit. What's interesting is twofold to this. First, how they figured out whether or not it indeed has a liquid ocean. They did this by modeling it, and they compared two theories. One of a oddly shaped and effectively ovaloid molten core, which they found would really not be possible unless the molten core was like a pancake and incredibly unrealistic. The second being the idea of the watery ocean, which is what they decided on after the unrealism of the first possibility. The second important aspect to this is when it happened. They do believe that the ocean is a relatively new phenomenon. Let's be clear about this. Relative in terms of astronomy, which is 25 million years ago. What they believe has happened is that somewhere about 2 to 3 million years ago, the moon itself was somehow interfered with by one of the larger moons, and because of that, it got knocked out of its orbit, just by a little bit, but that led to the orbit being more ovaloid around the planet it's orbiting. Because of this, my mass has periods where Saturn doesn't have the ability to affect it the same way, and that causes the internal heating of the moon to create some increased effect for a limited time. This is why you can gradually, slowly, get the ice melting, somewhat similar to what would happen when you put something in the microwave. One side of it gets heated, and then as you gradually turn it around, the other side gets heated while the other side cools slightly. It's a drastic oversimplification, but the general idea is the same. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.